Every family had a few side dishes that showed up like unwanted relatives. You didn't ask for them. You didn't invite them. But there they were, right next to your pork chop, daring you to complain. You learned real quick how to stall, how to rearrange your plate, and how to feed the dog without getting caught. And now? In this episode, we're counting down 20 weird southern sides we used to hate as kids, but now they taste like home. Buttered rutabagas. Rutabagas weren't something you noticed until they were already in the cart, rolling around down by the potatoes, like they were hoping nobody would make eye contact. You'd see them at places like A and P, or Piggly Wiggly, sitting in a wooden bin with dirt still stuck in the creases, always cheaper than whatever else was next to them. My aunt was the one who bought them, not my mother. She had a way of shopping where you could tell how the week had gone just by what was in the basket. The first time I remember eating them, they were mashed up on a plate that didn't quite match the rest of the set, with a square of butter melting into the top. The kitchen smelled like boiled cabbage and something faintly sweet, and it lingered longer than anybody wanted it to. Somebody said, "They're good for you," which was usually a warning, not a recommendation. They tasted like something between turnips and potatoes, only flatter. You didn't take a big bite. You took a careful one and chased it with whatever meat you had left. That night, the pork chops were thin, the kind you could almost see through, and everybody noticed even if nobody said anything. The rutabagas did their job. They filled the plate, and they made it look like supper was more than it really was. You still see them in stores sometimes, but back then they weren't a curiosity. They were just one of those quiet choices that told you money was tight without anybody having to say it out loud. 2. Scalloped cabbage with cracker crumbs. Scalloped cabbage was one of those dishes you could smell before you ever saw it. Not in a good way exactly, but in a familiar way. The kind of smell that told you somebody had bought the cheapest head of cabbage at the Piggly Wiggly and was determined to turn it into something that would last more than one night. The cabbage got boiled first, usually a little too long, then chopped up and layered into a baking dish with milk, salt, pepper, and whatever butter was left in the fridge. The topping was the best part, and also the most important part. It was usually saltines or Ritz, crushed up in a paper sack with a rolling pin, mixed with a little melted butter, and sprinkled over the top like that was supposed to fix everything underneath. It went into the oven and came out bubbling around the edges, with a top that looked better than it tasted. I remember seeing it most at my aunt's house, served next to thin pork chops or baked chicken legs, the kind with more bone than meat. You took a careful scoop because it was hot, and because you already knew what it was going to taste like. Soft cabbage, a little watery, and salty crumbs on top. It wasn't there because anyone especially loved it, except maybe Dad. It was there because cabbage was cheap, crackers were always in the cupboard, and it made the table look fuller than it really was. You almost never see it now, but for a long time, it was a regular on those old southern tables. 3. Corn pone casserole. Corn pone casserole was what happened when plain cornbread wasn't going to stretch far enough. You'd see the cornmeal come out of the cabinet, usually a bag of Martha White from the A&P, folded over at the top with a clothespin. The batter was mixed thinner than normal, poured into a baking dish instead of a skillet, and baked until it set up just enough to cut into squares. Sometimes there were bits of onion in it, sometimes a little grease brushed across the top, but most of the time it stayed simple. I remember it showing up at my grandmother's on nights when the main dish was mostly bone and gravy. The casserole went in the middle of the table, and everybody took a piece whether they wanted it or not. It wasn't sweet, and it wasn't meant to be. It was dry, a little crumbly, and it soaked up whatever you put next to it. That was the point. You'd use it to chase gravy, or to make the last of the beans look like more than they were. If there was any left, it got wrapped in foil and showed up again the next day, fried in a pan or eaten cold off a plate by the sink. You don't see corn pone casserole much anymore. These days cornbread gets dressed up or turned into something fancy. Back then, this was just a way to turn a bag of cornmeal into another meal and make it last. 4. Fried peach cornbread. Fried peach cornbread wasn't something you saw at every house. It showed up at the one where somebody always had a few jars of home-canned peaches lined up in the pantry, or a couple of dented cans from the IGA shelf when fresh fruit wasn't an option. The batter started out like plain cornbread, mixed in a bowl that still had flour dust stuck to the rim. Then peaches went in, cut small so they wouldn't sink. The pan was already heating with grease in it, cracking and popping. I remember it at my uncle's place, usually on a Saturday, when supper was early, and nobody was pretending it was a special occasion. The pieces came out of the skillet browned and a little rough around the edges, stacked on a plate with a paper towel beneath to soak up the worst of it. They smelled sweet and hot at the same time, which was different from regular cornbread and just close enough to dessert to make you hopeful. They weren't. They were still supper food, and you ate them with beans or a thin slice of ham, not with ice cream. If any were left, they got wrapped in wax paper and set on the counter. You don't see fried peach cornbread much anymore. Not like that. Not in a hot skillet on a regular day. Not stacked on a chipped plate. Not made from whatever peaches happened to be in the pantry. It wasn't about treating anybody. It was just one more way to turn what you had into supper. 5. Stewed yellow squash and onions. There's something mighty comforting about a pot of stewed yellow squash and onions simmering low on the stove. The scent alone can take you back, maybe to your grandmother's kitchen on a July afternoon when the garden was full and the air hummed with cicadas. She'd slice those tender squash thin, toss in sweet onions, a pat of butter, and just enough salt and black pepper to wake it all up. Then she'd cover it with that old stained lid, letting it sweat and soften till everything melted together, golden and silky. That was the kind of dish that showed up when the garden was running over, when you picked squash so fast you didn't even bother counting, when supper wasn't planned so much as happened, right there in the pan. Serve it with a hot skillet of cornbread, and Lord, you might just forget whatever was bothering you. Because some dishes don't just feed the body, they hush the soul. And stewed squash does exactly that. 6. Tomato pudding. We didn't think tomato pudding was strange, not back then. It showed up right next to the meatloaf, sitting in one of those oval Corningware dishes with the little blue cornflower on the side. Mama would use canned tomatoes if the fresh ones were gone. Del Monte, usually. Dump them in a pan with sugar, butter, and a splash of vinegar. Then she'd tear up some old white bread right into the mix. No measurements, just what looked right. It baked up soft in the middle, crusty around the edges, smelled like ketchup, and pie had a baby. Daddy used to laugh and say it was dessert that accidentally sat too close to the biscuits. I remember poking at it with my fork the first time, certain it had to be a mistake. But then you taste it, that warm, sweet tang and the butter-soaked bread. And next thing you know, you're fighting your brother for the last spoonful. That's how it was in our house. Some recipes didn't make sense till you tasted them hot, sitting at a kitchen table with the vinyl peeling at the corners. 7. Onion casserole with cornflakes. I hadn't thought about onion casserole in years, not since Mama used to bring it to church suppers. You'd see her coming through the fellowship hall with that tan Tupperware carrier, the one with the cracked handle, and you knew right off what was inside just by the smell. She'd slice up Vidalia onions till her eyes watered, stir 'em into a mix of sour cream and shredded cheese, usually whatever was on sale that week, sometimes Cracker Barrel, sometimes the store brand that came in the plain red bag. Then came the best part. She'd crush a handful of cornflakes right over the top, pour a little melted butter across them, and call it good. No panko, no fancy topping, just that sweet, buttery crunch that told you it was done when the edges turned brown. I remember how it'd sound when you scooped the first spoonful. That soft scrape of metal on glass, the steam hitting your face. Somebody always asked for seconds before the bowl even made it halfway down the table. 8. Sweet and sour green beans. Sweet and sour green beans always showed up when somebody was trying to make canned beans taste special. Usually, the label still said Del Monte under the steam. Moma'd drain a couple cans, toss in some crumbled bacon, and pour in a sauce made from ketchup, sugar, and a splash of vinegar. Looked strange while it was cooking, smelled a little stranger, but somehow it worked. I remember that mix of sweet tang and bacon grease clinging to the spoon, the color just a shade too red to seem natural. She'd serve it warm in that glass bowl with the chipped rim, and somehow it disappeared before the rolls did. Mr. Greer from down the street used to call it church beans, said every potluck had at least 2 versions on the table, one too sweet and one just right. Ours leaned sweet. You could tell when folks hit that perfect bite, 'cause the table went quiet for a second, like everybody had the same memory at once. 9. Baked rice with raisins. We didn't have dessert too often, but every now and then, Ma would make baked rice with raisins. Usually it happened when there was leftover rice from supper and a half-empty box of Sun-Maid sitting in the cabinet. She'd stir the rice with a little milk, sugar, and butter in that dented white enamel pan with the black rim. If there was an egg to spare, she'd crack one in. No measuring cups, just judgment. The raisins always came out in clumps, hard as pebbles, till the heat softened 'em up. It'd bake slow, smelling like warm cereal and burnt edges. We'd stand around the stove waiting for her to say it was ready, spoons already in our hands. The top layer got a little chewy, the bottom slick with milk. She never called it pudding, just said, "It ain't bad." We'd eat it straight from the dish while it was too hot, raisin skins split open, sugar sticking to the spoon. That was about as close as our house got to dessert on a weekday. And once that pan was scraped clean, somebody'd start asking what she was making next. 10. Brown sugar-glazed turnips. Turnips usually showed up plain, boiled, and smelling like they meant it. The brown sugar version only came out when somebody was trying to make them go down easier. I remember them at my grandmother's, the kind of supper where the main dish was already thin and nobody said so. The turnips were cut into chunks, cooked until they stopped fighting the knife, then slid back into the pan with a spoon of brown sugar and a little butter. The stove stayed on just long enough for it to turn sticky. You could see the sugar melt and darken, and you could smell it before it hit the table. That smell was the whole point. It bought the dish a few seconds of goodwill. On your plate, the turnips still looked like turnips, only darker and shiny, and you already knew the first bite was going to be soft and sweet and still have that edge underneath. These showed up when the bag from Piggly Wiggly was light, and somebody had decided to spend the extra nickel on sugar instead of another can of something. The glaze made it look like more work had gone into it than really had. You ate them next to whatever meat there was, or next to beans when there wasn't much meat at all, and you didn't take seconds. Nobody asked for brown sugar turnips. They were a small attempt at mercy, and for one meal, they worked well enough. 11. Creamed pearl onions. Creamed pearl onions didn't come from the produce section. They came from a small, stiff bag in the freezer case, the kind you grabbed at A&P when you were already there for something else. The onions were already peeled, already the right size, and already a little suspicious. They went into a saucepan with milk, butter, and flour, and the stove did the rest. I remember them showing up at my grandmother's when company was coming, not because anyone loved them, but because they looked like you'd tried. They sat in a bowl that didn't get used much, pale and round and floating in white sauce. Somebody always said they were good for you, which was never as reassuring as they probably meant it to be. They tasted like warm milk first, and onions second. The sauce did most of the talking. You took a small spoonful, mostly to be polite, and pushed them around your plate if nobody was watching. They went next to ham more than anything else, usually the kind that had been sliced thin to make it last. You don't see creamed pearl onions much anymore. For a while, though, they were one of those dishes that only showed up when the table was trying to look a little better than usual, even if not everyone was especially excited about them. 12. Buttermilk spoon bread. Buttermilk spoon bread was what showed up when somebody wanted cornbread, but didn't want to wait on a skillet. It came out softer, paler, and had to be served with a spoon because it wouldn't hold its shape long enough to pretend it was anything else. I remember it most at my aunt's house, in a square baking dish with the corners already chipped, set right in the middle of the table. The batter was thin, mixed from cornmeal, eggs, and buttermilk that came out of a paper carton from the A&P. It went into the oven and came back looking like it wasn't quite finished, even when it was. The first scoop always collapsed back into itself, and somebody would joke that it wasn't done yet, even though everybody knew it was. You'd get a shallow spoonful, set it next to your pork chop or your beans, and watch the steam come out of it while the top slowly sank. If there was gravy, it ran straight into it and disappeared. If there wasn't, you salted it and kept eating anyway. I remember one night when the roast didn't go far, and nobody said anything. But the spoon-bread dish got scraped clean. The pan went back to the sink empty, which told you everything you needed to know about why it was there. 13. Sweet potato casserole with lemon extract. I knew something was wrong before it ever hit my plate. Sweet potatoes were supposed to smell like sugar and butter. This didn't. It had that sharp, clean smell that didn't belong anywhere near a dinner table. She set the dish down and said, "It's good. Just eat it." That's how you knew it wasn't. I took a small spoonful, the kind you take when you're hoping to get away with it. The first second was sweet. Then the lemon showed up and wiped that out. It didn't taste like dessert. It didn't taste like a side dish either. It tasted like somebody had made a mistake and decided to serve it anyway. I tried to fix it with salt. That didn't help. I tried to hide it under my pork chop. That didn't work either. Every bite after that got smaller. Across the table, somebody else stopped chewing and looked down at their plate like it had changed on them. Nobody said anything, but nobody went back for seconds either. The dish stayed right there in the middle, looking the same when supper was over as it did when it started. I sat there longer than I wanted to, moving it around and waiting for somebody to say I was done. When they finally did, the plate went to the sink with most of it still on it. That was the last time I remember that lemon bottle coming out at supper. 14. Pineapple cheese rice. I didn't understand what it was supposed to be before it hit the table, and I didn't understand it any better once it did. Rice made sense. Cheese made sense. Pineapple didn't belong with either of them, and you didn't need straight A's in science to know that. It came out in a square dish, yellow and pale at the same time, with little wet chunks sitting in it, like they'd been dropped there by accident. Somebody said it was different, which was never a good sign. A spoon went into it and came back out trailing strings of cheese and pineapple juice. I took a bite because I had to. The rice was hot. The pineapple was sweet and cold in the middle. The cheese tried to pull it all together and failed. My mouth didn't know what it was supposed to do with it, so I just chewed and waited for it to be over. Across the table, my sister put her fork down and stared at her plate like it might move on its own. Somebody else scraped theirs into a napkin when they thought nobody was looking. No one asked for seconds. The dish stayed half full and kept getting passed anyway. By the end of supper, the good food was gone, and that was still sitting there, cooling off and getting stiffer. It went back in the fridge and showed up again the next day. It didn't get better either. It just made us kids all a little sad knowing we had to eat it again. 15. Baked buttered grits. I already didn't like grits, so baking them felt personal. They came out of the oven in a square pan, cut into pieces like cornbread, and somehow that made it worse. On the surface, they looked firm, but the middle still moved when the spoon went in. Butter was melted over the top, but it didn't soak in. It just sat there, shining. Somebody said they were good this way, which meant I was about to find out. The first bite was hot and dry at the same time. The edges held together, but the center fell apart and turned back into regular grits in my mouth. There wasn't much taste to hide behind, just corn and salt and butter. That didn't help as much as it should have. I tried cutting it smaller, like that would change something. It didn't. Across the table, somebody was already done and waiting, which made it worse. I slowed down and pushed it around, hoping nobody noticed how little was disappearing. The pan went back to the kitchen with a few pieces still in it. They showed up cold the next day, firmer and quieter, and nobody rushed to claim them, except maybe Dad. 16. Green tomato casserole. I thought it was going to be fried green tomatoes. That's what it looked like in the pan before it went in the oven. Then it came back out softer, stacked in layers, and smelling like vinegar and onions had gotten into a fight. Mom cut it into squares and put one on my plate before I could say anything. The top looked dry, like it might hold together. It didn't. The fork went in, and the middle slid away from itself, hot and wet, leaving the crust behind. The first bite was sharp, not rotten, not exactly bad, just green. Sour enough to make your jaw tighten. There was breading in there and some kind of sauce, but the tomatoes stayed in charge. I took a second bite to see if it got better. Let's just say I was sorely disappointed. Across the table, somebody asked for more potatoes instead. It made for an awkward moment at the dinner table, one that we all kept waiting for someone else to save us from. 17. Celery seed slaw. I thought it was regular slaw until I took the first bite. It looked right. Same pale cabbage, same thin carrots, same white dressing. Then the celery seed hit, and it didn't fade. It stayed right there, sharp and a little bitter, stuck in your teeth and in your head at the same time. Somebody had mixed it in a big bowl and set it on the table like it was nothing new. I took a forkful because slaw was usually safe. Halfway through chewing, I stopped and tried to figure out what I'd just bitten into. It wasn't bad enough to spit out. It was worse than that. It made you keep chewing and paying attention. Across the table, my brother drank his tea too fast and said he needed more. My aunt said, "It's the seeds." Like that explained anything. I tried another bite, smaller this time. The cabbage was cold. The dressing was sweet. The seeds kept cutting through both. People kept passing the bowl. The spoon went in once more and came back out with too much dressing and not enough cabbage. When the plates got stacked, there was still slaw in the bottom, thin and wet, with the seeds floating on top like they'd won. 18. Fried cabbage with fatback. The fatback was cut thick, and you could see the white stripe in every piece. When it hit my plate, the cabbage was already shiny and limp, piled over it like it was trying to hide what was underneath. I moved a forkful to the side, and there it was, browned on the edges, still pale in the middle. I took a bite of cabbage first. It was salty and soft and tasted like the pan. Then I hit the fatback by accident. It didn't chew the way I expected. It just stayed there until I had to decide what to do with it. I tried again, smaller this time, and it was worse. Across the table, my dad finished his and asked for bread. My sister cut around the fat and left it in a neat line. I kept working at mine until there was only cabbage left, and one piece I couldn't make disappear. When the plates got cleared, that piece was still there, right where I'd pushed it. These days, I like a good plate of fried cabbage and fatback. Sometimes I wish I could go back in time and appreciate it more. 19. Dixie succotash. I thought it was just corn when it got set down. Then I saw the beans mixed through it and knew I'd been tricked. The bowl looked cheerful enough, yellow and green, but the smell was all boiled vegetables and something sweet that didn't belong there. I took a bite because it was already on my plate. The corn was soft, and the beans were softer, and they didn't want to stay together. It tasted like two sides that had been told to get along and never really did. I tried a second bite, smaller, to see if I might change my mind. All I can say is I gave it the old college try. Across the table, my brother started picking out the corn and lining the beans up on the edge of his plate like he was sorting screws. My mother told him to stop playing with his food and eat it. He did, but slower. I kept going too, because that was the rule, and because the rest of the plate was already getting cold. Halfway through, somebody asked for more meat instead. The only answer was the sound of crickets. The bowl stayed where it was, and the serving spoon rested across the top like it had quit. When the plates got cleared, there was still succotash left in the bottom, streaked where the spoon had scraped it and stopped. 20. Potato puff bake. I thought it was going to be good because it came out of the oven looking like something from a box picture. The top was all little brown squares, lined up like they meant business. Somebody said, "Careful, it's hot," and cut it into pieces, building the anticipation for something we thought would be worth the wait. The first bite was all crust and steam. The second bite found the middle, and that's where it went soft and heavy at the same time. The potato puffs turned back into mashed potatoes in my mouth, and the stuff underneath them tasted like it had been waiting there all afternoon. I couldn't tell what was supposed to be the main part and what was supposed to be the side. It all felt like the same thing. Across the table, my sister peeled the crispy ones off the top and left the rest. My dad ate it without looking at it and asked for more pepper. I tried to keep my bites on the edges where it still had some shape, but the fork kept sinking through anyway. When I was done, there was a pale square in the middle of my plate where I'd stopped. The pan went back to the counter with the top picked clean and the soft part still sitting there. These sides did not just up and disappear. The kitchen changed first. Stores got bigger, freezers got louder, and weeknights got shorter. The old routines did not quit working. There just was not room for them anymore. Look in old notebooks, in church cookbooks, or in the way someone older still reaches for a pan without checking a recipe. And when you make one again, you will remember the motions before the flavor ever hits you.